Now that I've introduced the concept of what a factory method is to make completable futures, let's take a look at how they can be applied. Once again, we're going to multiply big fraction objects, and it's kind of fun to compare and contrast this example with the one we just looked at that only used the basic features. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of using factory methods. So here's the example. As before, we've got some strings, and we'll show the stuff on the right-hand side just to illustrate how that all works. First thing we do here is we call supplyAsync. Remember, supplyAsync is static, so you don't need an object to call it. You just need to give it the class name. So we say CompletableFuture.supplyAsync. And this will take the lambda supplier, the supplier lambda that we pass in here, and it arranges to execute this supplier lambda in the common ForkJoinPool, because we're not passing an executor here as a second parameter. Here's the supplier lambda. It does what we did before. It's going to take two big fractions that are initialized from these two strings and multiply them in the background. So you can see here, looking at the interaction diagram, the main thread called supplyAsync on CompletableFuture, which will turn around under the hood, as we'll see in the next lesson, and execute this supplier lambda, or arrange to execute the supplier lambda in the context of the common ForkJoinPool. This supplier lambda and whatever comes after in the ... part here will run concurrently. That's the benefit of using completable futures, is to get things to run asynchronously and concurrently. And then the main part of the code here will just join until this computation is complete. We haven't gotten to the completion stage methods yet, so I haven't talked about all the other cool things you could do here. This is still a bit limited, but at least we're not having to worry about having threads being created explicitly in this code. And you can see here, when join is called, it essentially waits for the completable future to finish, and there's some internal code that we'll look at briefly in just a moment. So let's kind of talk about this, what's good and bad about it. So first, let's talk about the benefits of using supplyAsync relative to other things, like creating a thread and explicitly completing it. So one nice thing is here, we don't have to explicitly complete the future, since supplyAsync returns a completable future. And so it returns a completable future to a big fraction that will be completed by the time you do something to that completable future. So you can see here, you don't have to complete it explicitly. You just call supplyAsync, you get back a completable future, and then you do something with it. In this case, we just join with it, but in other cases, you could do something more interesting. You also don't have to explicitly create and use threads. So if you go back and watch the earlier example where we just used the basic features, we had to make a thread, and then that thread would have to be started. We would have to join explicitly. So there was just a little bit of extra ceremony involved in getting those things to run. Whereas in this case, we just run the supplier lambda in the common ForkJoinPool. No need to do any threading. No need to do any synchronization. In this case, it just does its thing in the background. But of course, not everything is rainbows and unicorns, so there are some downsides with using supplyAsync in the way that we've done it here. We still have the problem in this example of calling join. So this has all the same problems we've talked about before, about underutilizing the CPU cores, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So the other thing to remember is that there's no timed join, so if we wanted to wait for a certain amount of time or bound the amount of time, we couldn't easily do it this way either. That naturally, all those issues, all those limitations and downsides and cons, as it were, are fixed in the advanced version of completable futures, which we're now going to start taking a look at with more comprehensiveness. So that's the end of the example of applying factory methods for the supplyAsync example using big fraction multiplication.